What is going on, chess YouTube? So in today's video, I want to show you a truly beautiful game played between Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT of chess, and Ding Liren, the former world champion of chess. And this game did take place in the 2022 Charity Cup prelims. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Ding Liren opens 1d4. That is his favorite first move as white, and Magnus goes 1, knight f6. Then we have c4, very standard stuff. And now here, most grandmasters nowadays do play 2 e6, heading for a queen's gambit decline or a Nimzo Indian defense. However, instead in this game, Magnus goes g6, and this is almost an old but forgotten move at the highest level these days. Of course, black is going to have the option of going either bishop g7 or d5 in response to knight to c3, heading for a king's Indian defense or a Grunfeld defense. However, Ding Liren is in no mood to play knight to c3 in this game. Instead, he plays a line that he has played quite a bit as white, and he has destroyed a lot of top grandmasters with this line. Of course, I'm talking about the anti-Grunfeld line, 3f3, intending e4, getting that very strong same-ish style pawn structure in the center of the board. And how is Magnus going to want to respond in this game? Well, black has a lot of different playable moves. For example, bishop g7 heading for a king's Indian defense is playable. You can go c5 heading for a modern Benini structure. You can also go, say, e6, maybe even e5, and knight c6. In the game, though, e6 chosen, and this move, believe it or not, is not designed to play d5. Instead here, black wants to go e6 and then c5, covering that c5 square with the bishop and therefore stopping d takes c5 ideas. And we'll have a transposition to a modern Benini style pawn structure, most likely. All right, now white goes e4, gaining control of the center, getting that very famous same-ish style pawn structure in the center. Black goes c5, challenging the white pawn structure on d4. Then we have d5, d6, and then knight to c3, e takes d5, c takes d5, and then finally bishop g7. Now here we have really the main starting point of this line for white and for black. We have a same-ish style pawn structure, but also it's a modern Benini style opening. Now here, white's main plan is very, very simple. He has to untangle his pieces, perhaps going for moves like bishop g5 or e3, queen d2, maybe knight gd2 to g3, bishop e2 and castles and so on. So white has the very difficult task of untangling all his pieces while maintaining the very strong pawn structure in the center of the board. Meanwhile, black is going to want to counterattack on the queen side and maybe even the king side with moves like a6 b5, maybe knight d7 to e5, maybe even h5 to h4 and so on. All right, here, what is white going to do? Well, here Ding Liren goes for the move bishop g5, a very aggressive move. Of course, the main lines here for white include bishop g5, bishop b3, bishop d3, and knight g to e2. In the game, though, bishop g5 chosen, putting immediate pressure on that knight on f6, pinning it to the queen on d8. And of course, white's main idea is to follow up queen d2 and maybe trade off bishops later with bishop h6, getting rid of those dark squared bishops. Now, in response, what is black going to do? Well, here Magnus goes h6, driving back that bishop on g5. Now, the bishop must retreat, bishop e3 chosen in the game. But now, this pawn on h6 is going to be a target for Ding Liren later in the game, obviously with the follow-up queen d2 coming very, very soon. All right, now here, Magnus, he inserts the move a6, threatening b5 next. b5 would be a very strong move for black, but here white goes a4, blocking that advance immediately on the queen side. Now, of course, if you go b5, I mean, you're losing at least a pawn, maybe even a rook after a takes, then rook takes a8. Therefore, black is going to have to find something else to do for now. In the game, short castles chosen by the GOAT. Then we have queen d2, again, piling up pressure on that pawn on h6. And this is maybe the first really critical point in the middle game in this chess game between Magnus and Ding Liren. Now, very importantly, what should black do about the defense of that pawn on h6? Well, it turns out there's very little you can do productively. King to h7 is very, very weak. h5 doesn't do a whole lot either. White just goes bishop h6. It turns out, believe it or not, what you want to do here as black in this exact position is ignore that pawn and gain control over the e-file with either rook to e8 or queen to e7. Now, why would you want to do that? Here's why. In the game, Magnus goes rook to e8, a very strong move, putting pressure on the e-file. Now, here is the point of this this operation. If white goes bishop takes h6, that would be a very significant mistake, as you can see by the eval bar starting to really shoot down. Here, black has the intermediate move, knight takes e4. The point being, no matter how you take it back, of course, the queen on d2 is being attacked. If you take back with the knight or the pawn, say knight takes e4, then black goes queen to h4 with the double attack on the bishop and the king on e1. Therefore, black wins back the pawn. This diagonal is opened up for the bishop and so on, and black is getting a tremendous initiative, whether it's a middle game or an end game with the queens flying off the board. So for that reason, black does not have to defend h6 yet. That pawn is defended via the weird tactics in this position. All right, instead, Ding Liren, he goes bishop c4, ignoring that pawn on h6. Of course, with every passing move, he maintains the option of taking on h6 later. Now, c4 is a very interesting placement for the bishop. The bishop usually goes on e2 instead of c4 in these lines, but instead, bishop c4 chosen in the game. Now here, Magnus, he has the option once again of defending h6 with either king to h7 or h5. h5 turns out is the strongest engine line here, but instead knight b d7 chosen by the goat. The point being of this move, it's very, very obvious. Black wants to go knight to e5, putting pressure on that bishop on c4, and if he can get that move in, knight to e5, unopposed, that bishop is going to have to go flying somewhere, and black's going to have an outstanding game. Now in the game, bishop e2 chosen by Ding Liren, getting his bishop off that c4 square preemptively. Now if black goes knight to e5, there is no target on c4 to harass, so a very good prophylactic move. Now, here's a big question. Why did white go bishop c4 in one go instead of just going bishop b2? Well, my thought process is maybe white was trying to force out the move knight b d7 from black prematurely. Maybe that was part of Ding Liren's preparation. I'm honestly not sure. If you know why white went bishop c4 only to go bishop e2 literally one move later in response to knight b d7, I mean, comment down below and share your thoughts on this move. I'm a little bit puzzled myself. I have some ideas, but really I can't quite figure this one out. So comment down below and fill me in terms of why that move was played right there. All right, here, Magnus Carlsen. He continues knight e5, but this turns out to be a very significant mistake in this game. Knight e5, like, it's good in principle, but without that bishop on c4, this move is not correct. Instead, queen to e7 in this position was the right continuation. What is the idea behind that? Well, black maintains various knight takes e4 ideas that he won't have if he goes for a premature knight to e5. Now, knight e5 chosen in the game, and here Ding Liren decides, you know what, now is the time to strike on the king side, and he goes for the move bishop takes h6, finally winning that hanging pawn on h6, and this is where the game gets absolutely crazy. This is the tactical fireworks show you have all been waiting for so far in this game. Now, technically here in this position, the computer says black simply has to eat being a down pawn. He has to go bishop d7, threatening b5. It turns out, for whatever reason, that is the right way forward. Instead here, Magnus says, you know what? I am going for the complications. I'm not sure if he misevaluated them or if he forgot his lines or what happened, but in the game, whatever the reason, he goes knight takes e4, winning the pawn on e4. But of course, Ding Liren, he is ready for it. So we have knight takes e4, then of course queen to h4 with the double attack on the king and the bishop on h6. That is, you know, very standard stuff in these lines. Here white goes g3, knocking back the queen. Now queen takes is forced. Now we have queen takes, then bishop takes. And here, in this position, Ding Liren, when he played the move 14, bishop takes h6, he saw all the way into the future in this position, and he knew in this position that knight would come to f6, forking the king and the rook. That is why this whole line is so good for white. And here, he just plays the move knight to f6. Now, very importantly, with that knight still on d7, then knight would cover f6. Therefore, knight f6 would not be a possibility. That is why knight e5 by Magnus was a mistake. And here we have knight f6, forking the king and the rook. White is going to be up the exchange, up the rook for that pony. White is going to be in control in the endgame. So king f8, knight takes e8, king takes e8, and here Ding Liren, normally when you have an advantage, you want to consolidate the advantage, you want to play a little bit solid, not do anything too risky, especially just after winning material. But here, Ding Liren knows this is no time to hold back. It is no time to slow down. And he goes for the alpha 0 advance on the king side, h4. A very, very strong move. The point being of this move, he wants to go h5, opening up the h file. And if he does that, this dormant rook on h1 will be activated. It will be flying up the board. That will be so good for Ding Liren. All right, bishop d7 chosen by Magnus, trying to get his queenside pieces into the game. But now we have the move h5, again, gaining more space. And again, if black takes on h5, the rook is activated. And if you don't take on h5, let's say you go g5, as Magnus did in the game, g5 chosen, then that pawn becomes a pass pawn. And that pawn is going to be a serious threat later in this game. All right, knight h3 chosen by white, pressuring that pawn on g5. How's black going to respond? He goes g4, gaining more space, trying to damage white's pawn structure on the king side here. Now we have f takes g4, then knight takes g4, then bishop takes, and then knight to f4. Jumping in towards the center of the board is white. All right, now we have a very complicated endgame here. Let's slow down just a little bit and take inventory here. In this position, Ding Liren, of course, he is up the exchange, but you can't count Magnus out. He has those two bishops on g4 and h6. Those bishops are very, very strong. They can go slicing down the board any which direction. And besides that, black has good potential to make a pass pawn on the queen side, starting with the move b5. Therefore here, Magnus, you really can't count this guy out. All right, now, king d7 chosen in the game. Magnus trying to centralize his king a little bit, and Ding Liren does the same thing. King to f2, bringing his king a little bit closer to the center of the board. Of course, it doesn't really have anywhere to go yet. It could go to e3, then e4, but then both e5 and f5 are blockaded currently, so we'll have to wait and see where that king is headed. All right, bishop g7 chosen by Magnus, putting pressure on that pawn on b2. Now, of course, that pawn's being attacked, and you can't move it, as then the rook on a1 would hang as well. What is Ding going to do about it? He just goes king to g2, sliding his king potentially off this diagonal. Maybe he was concerned about bishop d4 ideas hitting the king on f2, so maybe that was one of the ideas here. Now we have bishop f5, retreating the bishop, but now here, Ding Liren, he strikes with the king. King to f3, the king march has begun. That king is going to go marching all the way up the board. Now, very importantly, this pawn on b2 has been under fire for a while, but black did not take it yet until this move. Here, Magnus, he does take on b2. Bishop takes b2, chosen in the game. But what is the problem with this move? It's very simple. Here, white finds an unbelievable rook sacrifice / exchange sacrifice, whatever you want to call it. Now, this bishop on f5, it is controlling b1, but here Ding Liren, he sees into the future. He steps into his time machine. He understands, you know what? I can give up a rook. That my game is so good right now. I can give up the rook for the light squared bishop, and he goes rook b1, pressuring the bishop on b2 and pressuring the pawn on b7. Of course, here Magnus will take on b1. Bishop takes b1, chosen in the game. Then rook takes b1, and now again, this bishop on b2 must move. And as soon as it does, white's going to win the pawn on b7 with check and get a huge initiative in this endgame. All right, bishop e5 chosen. The bishop very well centralized on e5 is defended by the pawn on d6. But here, Ding Liren, he just crashes through. Rook takes b7, winning the pawn, hitting the king on d7. The king's got to move, and it's got to go where it can defend that pawn on f7. Therefore, king to e8 is really the only move. If you go, say, king c8, then you lose the pawn on f7 as well, and likely the game with it. All right, now here, Ding Liren, g4 is the move, gaining space on the king side. Where's black going to go? Magnus goes rook to c8, lining up his rook behind that very far advanced pawn on c5. Very good by Magnus, but here Ding Liren, he is not done. g5 is the move, gaining even more space on the king side. Now we have c4, advancing the pawn down the board. Now g6. Now here, Ding Liren, he's threatening either g takes f7 with check, or even just perhaps g7, g8 later. Black's obviously going to have to respond. In the game, f takes g6 chosen, then h takes g6, and here, Black, he slides his king over, trying to guard that g8 queening square prematurely. He goes king to f8, again, trying to get there in time to stop g7, g8 ideas. Now here, Ding Liren, he jumps in with the knight, knight to e6, hitting that king on f8. The king's got to move, king g8, chosen in the game. Again, virtually the only move. If instead you go king to e8, then g7, g8 is the threat. That would be deadly. All right, now, Ding Liren, king to e2. He begins to march his king back to defend against the advanced pawn on c4. Black was threatening c2, c3, c2, c1, and so on. Therefore, getting the king back makes a lot of sense. Now, c3 chosen in the game, king to d1, then a5. Magnus just locking down the king side. But unfortunately for Magnus, this move, a5, right here, I'm giving it 2 question marks. It turns out to be a massive mistake. What is the problem with this move? It's very simple. You can't do that. Instead, the right move is c2, forcing king c1, and then later in the game, maybe you can go perhaps bishop b2, bishop f4, and so on, forcing the king off that queening square. Of course, right now, the knight and the rook do control those squares. However, that is the idea in the future, forcing the king off that c1 square, then you crash through with the move c1 queen. And if Magnus had played this move, c2, right here, he would still be in the game. But instead, a5 chosen in the game, trying to lock down the queen side. But again, this is a massive mistake here. Ding Liren, he just goes king to c2, blockading that pawn on c3. Now the pawn cannot move. The king is very, very safe on that c2 square. It is going nowhere right now. And what is Black going to do about this? I don't know. In the game, Magnus does his best to defend, and the game goes on. Rook to a8. I guess he's trying to defend a5 prematurely and preemptively, sorry. And beyond that, there's not a whole lot he can do productively. All right, now, rook b5. Ding Liren applying a little bit of pressure to that pawn on the a5 square. Then we have bishop f6. Again, Magnus dropping back, trying to play defensively. Now, rook b6 and then bishop b5. Ding putting a little bit of pressure on that pawn on d6, and Magnus defending with the bishop. So, very solid. If I can draw arrows correctly, very solid. Now, rook b7, bishop f6, and finally, rook c7, pressuring that pawn on c3. Of course, the bishop does defend for right now. You don't really want to give up your rook for that pawn and the bishop. That would not be a good idea. Bishop e5, chosen by Magnus. And now, finally, king d3. Ding Liren, he decides it is finally time to bring the king all the way back to the king side, maybe even to h6, to try and push this pawn through. Now, this is a very delicate balance here. Of course, before, when white blockaded with king c2, the rook was behind the pawn. Now, white does control the c-file. That means black has no easy way to force through c2 without losing the pawn. Therefore, Ding will have enough time, again, to march the king all the way up over to perhaps h7. All right, now, bishop f6 chosen in the game by Magnus. Again, Magnus making a lot of waiting moves here. There's not a whole lot he can do productively. King to e4, bishop b5, king f5, rook b8, king g5. Ding Liren, he's showing his hand. He wants to go king to h6, then somehow threaten checkmate, maybe threaten, g7, rook f7, rook f8, and so on. There are a lot of different ideas here that Ding Liren has. All right, Magnus, rook to a8. He knows you cannot go, say, rook b2, as then literally, white would have checkmate with rook to c8. That would be a back rank mate. Instead, rook to a8 chosen in the game. Magnus keeping his rook on that back rank at all costs. Now, king to h6, marching the king up. Rook to e8, sliding over, defending against various, rook to c8 ideas still. And now Ding, he plays the final move of the game. He just goes g7. This move is so strong. It is setting up the threat of rook to f7, then rook to f8, forcing the rooks off the board. For example, rook takes, then you take with a pawn, promote to a queen. There's very little stopping that idea. I mean, maybe you take the pawn on g7, but then white takes back with the rook and so on. That's going to be mate in short order. And overall, there's just really nothing black can do, and for that reason, Magnus, despite being the greatest endgame player of all time, he is forced to resign on the spot to Ding Liren in this one-sided endgame from the 2022 Charity Cup, but again, between Magnus and Ding. Wow, what a game between Ding Liren, the former world champion, and Magnus Carlsen again in the 2022 Charity Cup tournament. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, comment down below what you thought of today's game, especially the crazy tactical fireworks starting with the move. Let's see here. The move 95, the mistake by Magnus. Then knight gives up control of that f6 square, and then Ding Liren goes bishop takes h6, forcing knight takes e4 from Magnus, and from there, the entire game exploded into tactical fireworks again, finishing in that knight to f6 tactical shot. Winning the rook on e8 was Ding, and then, of course, the alpha 0 advance on the king side and so on. I mean, what a crazy game right here. So anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Again, comment down below what you thought. And if you want to see more action between Magnus and Ding, check out this video right here where I cover yet another one of their, greatest games they played ever. If you want more Magnus versus Ding Liren action, check that game out, and I'll see you in the next video.